Next up is Dr. Noah Petro of the Goddard Space Flight Center, speaking about understanding the lunar environment and its effects on materials, insights from Apollo 17's long-term lunar surface exposure experiment, and Surveyor 7.
All right, thank you so much. And I assume you can hear me okay. So it's going to be a little different than maybe some of the other presentations you've seen over the last day and a half. I really wanted to just instill a couple thoughts of what we could do to expand upon what will be done as part of Artemis. And of course, Artemis is a program that has been directed to go to the south pole of the moon, 84 degrees and poleward. But in reviewing the Artemis 3 Science Definition Team Report, as well as other guiding documents, the importance of understanding how surface materials, that is not just the geologic samples that we want to collect, but also hardware, how does hardware respond to being in the lunar environment? And of course, right now, there's no lunar hardware exposed at the South Pole. And of course, that'll change very soon. But with the stated goal of developing a sustainable lunar presence, I think it's incumbent upon us to understand how the surface of the moon, the environment of the surface of the moon interacts with surface hardware. And of course, if we're going to have a sustainable presence, that means we're going to have material, hardware on the surface for longer than 6.5 days. In fact, we'll have hardware hopefully on the surface for months and years that's being used. And so I wanted to present the possibility of expanding upon the Artemis zone with excursions and with sorties, as it were, to places outside of the Artemis zone. And in particular, I'll focus on a return to the Apollo 17 site, as well as the possible revisit of a Surveyor 7 landing site. Of course, as has been discussed in other sessions as part of this conference, we know that hardware on the surface does last. We see in the narrow angle camera images from LRO, we see the hardware still sitting on the surface. We know it has been completely obliterated. We also know that the lunar retroreflectors are still operational. And so we know to a certain degree that hardware can withstand being on the lunar surface for many decades, but getting the fine scale understanding of how different materials respond to the lunar environment is something that could be achieved with a visit to one of these sites. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so this is sort of a review of what I was just saying, but again, expanding upon the South Pole, and that 84 degree and south location is essentially covered by that star at the South Pole. And going outside of the Artemis zone would require a visit either to the north rim of Tycho crater or a return to the Apollo 17 landing site. Right now, the longest baseline of observation that we have for surface exposed hardware at the moon was the Surveyor 3 lander, which was on the surface for just under 950 days before Apollo 12 went and returned samples from that lander. And so if we want to build upon effectively just under 3 years worth of exposure, a return to one of these other sites could fit the bill. That's not to say that there won't be hardware that's delivered to the Artemis zone in the next few years. We heard about Viper, and of course Viper is going to be going to a South Pole site. But in terms of getting longer than just a few years of exposure, we really have to go outside the Artemis zone to get US hardware on the surface. Let's go to the next slide, please. So I want to start with a discussion of what we could glean from a return to the Apollo 17 site. And this was all really inspired by this really clever experiment that Fred Hertz at the Johnson Space Center envisioned in the preparation for Apollo 17. This technical report about the photo documentation of the long-term surface exposure experiment really summarizes what he set out to do so nicely. And that was to use the Apollo 17 mission as a natural experiment with the idea that eventually it would be revisited. And I think at the time, of course, we all expected that Apollo would soon be followed by another set of lunar explorations, but here we are almost 50 years later. And I think it might be time to revisit the Apollo 17 landing site, not only to return the hardware, but also other material that was left behind, whether it's the jet bag that includes astronaut waste. There's certainly astrobiological implications for studying other materials than just hardware, whether it's nylon or mylar or any of the other materials that were left behind by the Apollo 17 mission. Of course, there's other material. There's a geologic exploration that could be conducted as well. We've learned a lot about the Apollo 17 landing site in the subsequent 50 years. And so, as much as a mission, for instance, going back to sample hardware, would also build upon the geologic legacy of Apollo 17 and expand our understanding of the geologic history of the moon. I also want to point out that one of the science goals of Artemis is to build up geophysical measurements, and by getting outside of that Artemis zone at the South Pole, we could extend a baseline of measurements of whether it's retroreflectors, because Apollo 17 did not carry a retroreflector to the moon, or other geophysical measurements. The Taurus Littrow Valley is a perfect location to establish one of those geophysical stations. Next slide, please. Of course, one of the goals of returning hardware is to compare it to the previous, to what it was like 50 years ago. And that report, which the QR code will take you to, reviews the photo documentation. Again, what Fred did was image select pieces of hardware at up to 200 microns, and parts of it at better resolutions than that. We need to recover the original scans, original negatives that were part of that study. Of course, we also have these wonderful scans of the original surface documentation images to serve as a before image as well. So I think we have a pretty good handle on what the hardware would have looked like at the time of deployment or pre-launch. It's just a matter of going and now exploring how it's reacted, how that hardware has reacted to 50 plus years on the lunar surface. Next slide, please. The other possible location, and again, I'm only considering US hardware here, is basically a redux of the Apollo 12 experiment. Instead of going to Surveyor 3 or other hardware from Apollo, Surveyor 7 was the furthest south of a Surveyor landing. It's on the north rim of Tycho crater, which in and of itself is a wonderful geologic target. Of course, Apollo 12 returned parts of the TV camera, as well as mirrors that were mounted along with that. One could imagine returning any number of materials from the lander, including magnets that were deployed as part of a magnetometer experiment. Of course, consideration must be given to landing not just on top of the lander to introduce modern contamination, but I think one could come up with a extensive exploration plan that not only visits the Surveyor 7 target, but is material ejected by the Tycho crater as well. Let's go to the next slide. And of course, Tycho itself is an important target. We see Tycho ejected material not only potentially going to Apollo 17, but also across the South Pole. And there's an important tie there that by nailing down the age of Tycho, which is still open to some small amount of debate, we could indeed inform what we might be sampling at the South Pole as well, if there is indeed ejecta contributing to the South Pole from Tycho. As I said with Apollo 17, this also gives us about a 60-degree separation for a geophysical station. Again, more nodes, broader network, we could potentially expand upon a geophysical network. Let's go to the last slide here. And this just sort of summarizes what we could do. Again, I don't want to belabor the point, but I think we should consider, if we could argue for a non-polar landing site, what will we do there? Obviously, there are many geologic targets to go to, but witness place science, not only as part of Artemis, but also reaching back to Surveyor and Apollo would be important. The question in the chat is about why not consider lunicod sites. Absolutely could. I'm just trying to avoid any international incidents in going and poking around at other countries' hardware. Of course, it's all there for peace and science. Any of the lunicod sites would be incredibly valuable as well, but I'm just factoring in what could be done for an Apollo site here. But certainly we should consider what targets might be achievable anywhere on the surface of the moon. And with that, I will conclude. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Petro.